Imagine sitting down to dinner, but there's no fork in sight. It's no neatly folded napkin, no polished silver cutlery glinting in the candlelight. Instead, you've got your hands, a knife at your belt, and maybe a spoon if you're lucky. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where eating wasn't just about filling your stomach, but about navigating an entire culture of customs, class distinctions, and culinary quirks all without the help of a fork. In medieval Europe, the fork wasn't completely unknown, but it was far from common. It existed in some parts of the Byzantine Empire and even made appearances in Italy by the 11th century. But for the average person in medieval England or France, it was virtually non-existent. Using a fork was considered either effeminate, foreign, or even sinful by some religious figures who thought it was unnatural to eat with something other than what God gave you, your hands. So people adapted. They used fingers with surprising skill, shared trenchers made of old bread, and sliced food with personal knives that were often carried everywhere, from feast to field. Meals in the Middle Ages weren't private affairs eaten alone in silence. They were loud, communal, and sometimes chaotic. At the Lord's table, dozens might dine together, seated on long benches, before platters piled high with roasted meats, stews, and bread. Trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, served as plates. These trenchers would soak up the juices and grease from the food and were either eaten at the end of the meal or given to the poor as alms. In more refined households, these might be replaced with wooden boards or metal platters, but bread remained the default for much of the population. You didn't eat in neat courses either. Dishes were often served all at once in what was called a service, and you'd pick and choose from the shared platters before you. Etiquette still existed, of course, though it depended greatly on your rank. Nobles were expected to behave with grace. You weren't supposed to reach too far, wipe your fingers on your neighbor, or use your knife to shovel food into your mouth. But peasants and laborers followed simpler rules. Eat quickly. Don't waste, and don't get caught stealing extra portions. Table manners were about knowing your place and showing respect, not necessarily about cleanliness as we think of it today. The food itself was a mix of hearty, flavorful, and sometimes strange by modern standards. Meats were usually boiled or roasted and seasoned with spices not only for taste, but also to mask spoilage, since refrigeration didn't exist. Sauces made with vinegar, wine, and herbs were ladled over poultry or fish. Vegetables were cooked into thick pottages, and grains like barley and rye made up the bulk of the diet for peasants. Nobles had access to finer wheat bread and exotic imports like sugar, almonds, and citrus fruits, though such luxuries were rare and expensive. And what about spoons? These were much more common than forks. People used them for soups, broths, and other liquid foods. Spoons might be made of wood, horn, or metal, and many people carried their own, just as they did with knives. If you forgot your spoon, you'd either borrow one, share one, or simply slurp from the bowl. Drinking was equally casual. Cups were shared among guests, especially in peasant households. If you were lucky enough to have your own mug or goblet, you guarded it carefully. Meals were also heavily shaped by the church calendar. Feast days were marked by indulgence in meat, while fast days, often making up nearly half the year, required abstaining from animal products. These days people turned to fish, legumes, nuts, and dairy, creating elaborate substitutes to mimic meat. Fish, pies, almond milk stews, and eel were all on the menu. Even with limited resources, medieval cooks found creative ways to keep meals satisfying, while following religious rules. Interestingly, the fork eventually did gain popularity, but not without controversy. In the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess used a fork at her wedding feast in Venice, church leaders were scandalized. Some saw the tiny metal prongs as tools of vanity and excess. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that forks slowly made their way into regular use in Western Europe, especially in France and England. Before that, hands remained king at the table, with all their mess efficiency and tactile delight. Eating with your hands wasn't just practical, it was intimate. You felt the warmth of your food, the texture of bread, the tenderness of roasted meat. It connected people to their meals in a way that modern cutlery sometimes interrupts. But it also required cleanliness. Before eating, hands were often washed in basins of water brought by servants or hosts, especially at noble feasts. It was a ritual of respect and preparation, marking the transition from labor or worship to the shared act of dining. And while we might turn up our noses at communal platters and greasy fingers, the truth is that medieval meals were rich with meaning. It reflected the season, the harvest, the social order, and the rhythm of life. To sit down at a medieval table was to experience community, hierarchy, survival, and celebration all at once. Children learned table manners from a young age. Boys were often taught by clerics or elders how to carve meat, serve wine, and behave properly at a feast. These lessons weren't just about manners. They were about growing into one's social role. A well-mannered squire might be noticed by a noble. Servant who spilled wine or reached too far might be dismissed. Dining was never just about the food. It was a performance. Yet for all the rules, there was joy in it too. Banquets were festive and lively, filled with music, laughter, and storytelling. Peasants held harvest feasts where ale flowed freely and songs filled the night. Weddings, saints' days, and successful hunts were all excuses to gather and share what little people had. The communal nature of medieval meals brought people together, binding them in tradition, faith, and the simple need to eat. And somewhere between the clatter of wooden cups and the clink of knives, between the rich spices of a noble's roast and the sour bite of a peasant's turnip stew, the story of the medieval table unfolds not as a place of elegance and order, but as a living reflection of the times. So the next time you reach for a fork, imagine what it would be like to eat with nothing but your hands, your knife, and your hunger. Imagine the joy of hot bread passed around a fire, the laughter over spilled stew, the humble grace of sharing a trench of bread with your neighbors. No forks, no problem. In the Middle Ages, it was just another day at the table. So now that you've had a taste of medieval dining, you might never look at your dinner fork the same way again. Back then, eating wasn't just a daily necessity. It was a hands-on experience filled with ritual, improvisation, and the occasional splash of spilled stew. Whether you were a noble carving roast pheasant with your personal blade, or a tired peasant dipping fingers into a shared pottage, food brought people together in ways that were messy, loud, and completely unforgettable. Forks may seem like second nature to us now, but in the Middle Ages, meals were about connection, not convenience. Every bite was tied to class, tradition, and a deep sense of place. People shared bread, passed jugs of ale, and used their hands with care and custom. It wasn't crew, it was just a different rhythm of life. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, imagine all the other little habits that shaped medieval life. What we take for granted today was once unimaginable. So next time you sit down to eat, maybe skip the fork for a moment. Feel the food. Think of the hands that built history one meal at a time. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay curious.